Imagine owning more silver than the entire world had ever seen. Now imagine that silver destroying your empire forever. Between 1492 and 1650, Spain extracted 150,000 tons of silver from the Americas. That's enough to fill 2,400 shipping containers. Enough to make every person in Madrid a millionaire by today's standards. Spain controlled the largest flow of precious metals in human history, and it completely annihilated their economy. Here's what nobody talks about. Spain didn't just get rich from American silver. They got so insanely, stupidly rich that they broke the fundamental laws of economics. They flooded Europe with so much treasure that they triggered the world's first global inflation crisis. Bread prices increased 400%. Basic goods became luxuries. Entire nations watched their currencies collapse as Spanish silver poured in like a tsunami. But what nobody knows is the twisted irony. While Spain was drowning Europe in silver, they were secretly going bankrupt. The more treasure they extracted, the poorer they became. By 1650, the Spanish Empire, owners of infinite wealth, couldn't afford to pay their own soldiers. This is the story of the most successful economic suicide in human history. How the Spanish treasure fleets created wealth beyond imagination, then used that exact wealth to destroy themselves and reshape the entire global economy forever. We're talking about ships carrying more treasure than entire countries' GDP, protected by cannons, hunted by pirates, and ultimately sinking under the weight of their own impossible success. This isn't just about gold and silver. This is about what happens when you break the economy itself. By 1650, Spain controlled territories 13 times larger than the Roman Empire at its peak. Spanish silver coins were accepted currency from Manila to Moscow, from Stockholm to the Sahara Desert. The Spanish piece of 8 became the world's first global currency, more trusted than gold, more valuable than kingdoms. But in 1491, none of this existed. Spain was broke, completely, embarrassingly bankrupt. Queen Isabella had to pawn her jewelry to fund Columbus's voyage. The Spanish crown owed money to Italian bankers, German merchants, and practically every wealthy family in Europe. Spain wasn't a global superpower. They were Europe's deadbeat debtor, struggling to afford basic military equipment while watching Portugal dominate ocean trade routes. What happened between 1492 and 1650 represents the most dramatic economic transformation in human history. Spain went from medieval poverty to controlling 80% of the world's precious metals. They built the largest navy ever assembled. They conquered territories spanning 4 continents. Spanish became the language of international commerce. But here's what the history books don't emphasize enough. This wasn't just remarkable success. This was economic insanity. The Spanish discovered something unprecedented in the mountains of Bolivia and Mexico. Silver mines so rich that a single mountain contained more precious metal than all of Europe combined. We're talking about the Cerro Rico mine in Potosí, Bolivia, which produced 60% of all silver mined in the world for over a century. Miners extracted so much silver that the mountain literally shrank. Local legends claimed you could build a silver bridge from Potosí to Madrid using just the silver from that one mine. And they nearly did. Between 1503 and 1650, Spanish treasure fleets transported 16,000 tons of silver and 180 tons of gold across the Atlantic. These weren't small shipments. These were floating treasures protected by warships, carrying wealth that exceeded most nations' entire economies. A single treasure fleet could carry more silver than most European countries minted in a decade. But Spain made a catastrophic mistake. They treated this silver like free money instead of recognizing it as a dangerous economic weapon. Every ounce of silver they pumped into European markets devalued existing currency. Every treasure ship that arrived in Seville pushed prices higher across the continent. Spain was accidentally conducting the world's first experiment in hyperinflation, and they were too blinded by wealth to notice they were destroying themselves. The irony runs deeper. While Spanish silver was making European merchants rich and transforming global trade, Spain itself was becoming increasingly dependent on imports. They stopped producing their own goods because buying from other countries seemed cheaper when you controlled infinite silver. Spanish agriculture declined. Spanish manufacturing collapsed. Spain became the richest economy in history, and completely hollow inside. What most people don't know is that Spanish bankruptcy wasn't a dramatic collapse. It was a slow-motion economic suicide that took 150 years to complete. Every treasure fleet that arrived made Spain simultaneously richer and poorer. Richer in silver, poorer in economic sustainability. The Spanish treasure fleet system wasn't just about moving precious metals. It was about fundamentally breaking how money worked. Before Spanish silver, European economies operated on gold standards and limited currency supplies. Inflation existed, but gradually. The Spanish flooded this system with so much silver that they triggered Europe's first experience with rapid, sustained price increases across multiple countries simultaneously. Let me take you back to 1492, when none of this existed. When Spain was a collection of small kingdoms struggling to afford basic governance, and silver was so rare that owning a silver cup marked you as wealthy. The transformation that followed wasn't just about one country getting rich. It was about accidentally inventing modern inflation and proving that infinite wealth can be more dangerous than poverty. This story spans 150 years, involves millions of deaths, reshapes 3 continents, and ends with the richest empire in history declaring bankruptcy while sitting on mountains of silver. The Spanish treasure fleets didn't just transport wealth, they transported economic destruction, disguised as prosperity. But to understand how Spain managed to destroy themselves with their own success, we need to go back to where it all started. A small Italian navigator with an impossible dream and a Spanish queen desperate enough to fund it. Chapter 1. Golden Discovery. October 12, 1492. Christopher Columbus steps onto a Caribbean beach and immediately starts looking for gold. Not trade routes, not spices, not new territories. Gold. Columbus's first recorded action in the Americas was questioning local Taino people about gold deposits using broken sign language and pure greed. Within hours of discovering the New World, Columbus was already planning how to extract its wealth back to Spain. You see, Columbus wasn't just an explorer. He was a walking economic disaster with royal backing. The man had spent 8 years begging European monarchs to fund his voyage west. Portugal rejected him. England rejected him. France thought he was delusional. Columbus's calculations were mathematically wrong. He believed the Earth was 25% smaller than it actually was, and that Asia was much closer to Europe than reality. Every expert who examined his proposal concluded that Columbus would die at sea long before reaching his destination. But Spain was desperate. Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand had just spent 7 years fighting the Granada War, expelling the last Muslim kingdoms from the Iberian Peninsula. The war had bankrupted the Spanish crown. They owed massive debts to Italian banks, German merchants, and various European creditors. Spain needed money badly enough to fund an impossible voyage by a man most experts considered a lunatic. The irony is staggering. Spain funded Columbus because they were broke, and Columbus discovered wealth that would eventually make Spain broker than they'd ever been before. Columbus's first voyage cost approximately 2 million maravedis, roughly equivalent to $50,000 today. Isabella famously pawned her jewelry to help fund the expedition. The entire Spanish investment in discovering the Americas was smaller than the cost of a modern luxury car. The return on investment, incalculable. Columbus returned from his first voyage with gold samples, exotic birds, and several kidnapped Taino people. He presented as proof of his success. More importantly, he returned with stories. Stories of rivers flowing with gold. Stories of mountains made of precious metals. Stories of indigenous people wearing gold ornaments like Europeans wore cloth. Most of these stories were exaggerated or completely fabricated. Columbus had found very little actual gold during his first voyage, but he understood that Spanish funding for future expeditions depended on promising infinite wealth, so he described the Caribbean as a treasure chest waiting to be opened. And Spain believed every word. Within months, Isabella and Ferdinand authorized Columbus's second voyage with 17 ships and 2,200 men. This wasn't exploration anymore, this was extraction. The Spanish crown issued explicit instructions: find gold, claim territories, and establish permanent settlements to facilitate treasure shipping back to Spain. Columbus's second voyage marked the beginning of Spanish treasure hunting in the Americas. but it also established the pattern that would eventually destroy Spain's economy. Spanish colonial policy from day one was based on extraction rather than production. They wanted to take American wealth, not build American economies. This extraction mindset created several problems that wouldn't become obvious for decades. First, Spain began viewing American territories as treasure mines rather than productive colonies. They focused on finding and shipping existing wealth rather than creating sustainable economic systems. Second, Spain started treating precious metals as infinite resources rather than recognizing that flooding European markets with gold and silver would devalue those metals. But in 1493, these problems seemed impossibly distant. Spain had exclusive access to an entire continent filled with potential wealth. Columbus had delivered exactly what he promised: new territories with gold deposits and indigenous populations that could be exploited for mining labor. The Spanish crown immediately began planning larger expeditions. Not just exploration missions, but full-scale colonial operations designed to extract maximum wealth from American territories. They established the House of Trade in Seville to regulate colonial commerce and ensure that all American wealth flowed directly to Spain. What nobody realized was that Columbus had accidentally triggered a 150-year economic suicide mission. The gold Columbus found in the Caribbean was minimal compared to what Spanish conquistadors would discover over the next 50 years. Hernán Cortés conquered the Aztec Empire and discovered their massive gold accumulations. Francisco Pizarro conquered the Inca Empire and found even larger silver deposits. But it was the discovery of silver mountains in Bolivia and Mexico that would transform Spain from a regional power into the world's first global economic superpower and set up their eventual collapse. Columbus died in 1506, believing he had discovered the eastern coast of Asia. He never realized he had found an entirely new continent. He never realized his discovery would reshape global economics. And he definitely never realized that Spanish success in the Americas would eventually make Spain the poorest rich country in human history. But in 1493, none of that mattered. What mattered was that Spain finally had access to American gold, and they were planning to take as much as physically possible. The Spanish treasure fleet system was about to begin, and with it, the most successful economic destruction in world history. Chapter 2: Fleet System. By 1503, Spanish ships were returning from the Americas with enough gold to change European currency values. This wasn't sustainable or safe. Pirates were already targeting Spanish vessels returning from the Caribbean. French corsairs, English privateers, and independent raiders had figured out that attacking a single Spanish treasure ship could provide more wealth than most successful merchants earned in a lifetime. Spanish colonial wealth was creating Spanish colonial vulnerability. The Spanish crown needed a solution that could protect massive treasure shipments while maintaining regular commerce with American territories. Their answer was the fleet system: convoys of merchant ships protected by warships, sailing together on synchronized schedules between Spain and the Americas. This system, formally established in 1566, became the backbone of Spanish colonial economics for over 200 years. But it also locked Spain into an extraction-based economy that would eventually prove catastrophic. Here's how the Spanish fleet system worked. Twice per year, massive convoys would depart from Seville carrying European goods to American colonies. These fleets would split into two groups, one heading to Mexico, another to South America. After spending months trading European manufactured goods for American precious metals, both fleets would reunite in Havana, Cuba, then return to Spain together as a single, heavily protected convoy, carrying the combined wealth of two continents. The scale was unprecedented. Each fleet consisted of 30 to 100 ships, including dedicated warships called galleons that could carry 500, 1,000 men and dozens of cannons. The merchant ships carried everything Spanish colonies needed: wine, olive oil, textiles, tools, weapons, books, furniture, and luxury goods. Spanish America couldn't produce most of these items locally, so they traded silver for European imports. This created the first truly global supply chain, but also the first global economic dependency. Spanish colonies became completely reliant on fleet shipments for basic goods: while Spain became completely reliant on colonial silver for economic stability. Neither side could function without the other, but the relationship was fundamentally unstable. The fleet system transported staggering amounts of wealth. Between 1566 and 1645, Spanish treasure fleets carried approximately 16,000 tons of silver and 180 tons of gold from the Americas to Europe. To put this in perspective, 16,000 tons of silver would fill 800 modern shipping containers. The treasure from a single fleet could exceed the entire annual tax revenue of most European nations. But the Spanish made a crucial mistake in how they managed this wealth. Instead of treating American silver as a valuable but finite resource that needed careful economic management, they treated it like free money that could solve any financial problem. Spanish kings used American treasure to fund European wars, pay foreign debts, and maintain lifestyles far beyond what Spanish domestic production could support. This created a dangerous economic pattern. Spain was becoming wealthy through extraction, while becoming economically hollow through consumption. Spanish agriculture declined because importing food seemed cheaper when you controlled unlimited silver. Spanish manufacturing collapsed because buying foreign goods was easier than developing domestic production. Spain was getting richer and weaker simultaneously. The fleet system also established Spanish control over American trade routes, but at enormous cost. Maintaining the fleet system required constant military investment. Spanish galleons needed regular replacement, upgrades, and repairs. Spanish naval bases throughout the Caribbean and Atlantic required permanent garrisons, fortifications, and supplies. The infrastructure needed to protect Spanish treasure was almost as expensive as the treasure itself. More problematically, the fleet system created artificial scarcity in Spanish colonial markets. Because Spanish America could only receive European goods twice per year through official fleet shipments, colonial prices for manufactured goods remained artificially high. This made Spanish colonies profitable for European merchants, but economically inefficient for colonial development. Spanish colonial cities like Mexico City, Lima, and Potosí became incredibly wealthy during fleet arrival seasons, then economically stagnant between fleet visits. This boom-bust cycle prevented stable economic development in Spanish America and ensured that colonial wealth would always flow back to Europe rather than creating sustainable American economies. The fleet system also made Spain increasingly vulnerable to military disruption. When Spanish fleets were delayed or attacked, both Spanish and colonial economies suffered immediate impacts. Spanish kings couldn't fund their European commitments without regular treasure shipments, while Spanish colonies couldn't obtain necessary European goods without fleet deliveries. This vulnerability became more dangerous as other European nations developed their own naval capabilities. England, France, and the Netherlands began specifically targeting Spanish treasure fleets as a form of economic warfare. Capturing a single Spanish fleet could fund an entire enemy nation's military operations for years. The most famous example occurred in 1628, when Dutch Admiral Piet Hein captured the entire Spanish treasure fleet near Cuba. This single victory provided the Dutch with 11.5 million guilders, enough wealth to fund the Dutch military for 8 months and seriously damaged Spanish European operations. But even when Spanish fleets successfully reached Europe, they were causing economic problems Spain didn't recognize. Every treasure ship that arrived in Seville dumped massive amounts of silver into European markets. This increased the European silver supply faster than European economic growth, which meant that silver became less valuable over time. Spain was accidentally devaluing their own primary asset through oversupply. Spanish economists of the period didn't understand inflation theory. They saw increasing prices for goods as evidence of economic growth rather than recognizing that rapidly expanding money supply was reducing currency value. Spain interpreted rising prices as prosperity rather than understanding that their treasure was making everyone poorer in real terms. The fleet system reached its peak effectiveness between 1580 and 1620, when Spanish naval power dominated Atlantic shipping routes and American silver production reached maximum output. During this period, Spanish treasure fleets were transporting wealth equivalent to 25% of European GDP annually. Spain controlled more liquid wealth than any nation in human history. But this peak was also the beginning of Spanish economic collapse. The more successful the fleet system became at extracting American wealth, the more dependent Spain became on continuous treasure imports. Spanish domestic production couldn't support Spanish lifestyle or military commitments without constant silver supplements from the Americas. By 1620, Spain had created an economic system that required infinite growth from finite resources. American silver mines wouldn't produce maximum output forever, but Spanish economic commitments assumed they would. The fleet system had transformed Spain into history's first example of resource curse. They were getting poorer by getting richer. The Spanish treasure fleet system was an incredible logistical and military achievement that successfully transported more wealth than anyone thought possible across some of the most dangerous ocean routes in the world. It was also an economic suicide machine that guaranteed Spanish collapse once American treasure production declined. But in 1566, when the fleet system was formally established, Spanish success seemed infinite. They had discovered silver mountains that appeared inexhaustible, and they were building the military infrastructure to protect unlimited wealth extraction. The Spanish Empire was about to enter its golden age and accidentally begin its economic destruction. Chapter 3. Silver Mountains. In 1545, Spanish prospectors discovered something that broke the global economy, a mountain made of silver. The Cerro Rico, literally rich hill, in Potosí, Bolivia, contained more silver than every other mine in world history combined. This wasn't a silver deposit. This was a silver mountain. Indigenous people had known about the silver for centuries, but considered it too dangerous to mine extensively. The Spanish had no such concerns about danger. Within 5 years of discovery, Potosí became the largest city in the Americas and the fourth largest city in the entire world. By 1600, Potosí's population reached 160,000 people, larger than London, larger than Madrid, larger than most European capitals. The city existed for one purpose, extracting silver so rapidly that it would reshape the global economy forever. But Potosí was just the beginning. Spanish conquistadors were simultaneously discovering massive silver deposits across Mexico, particularly in Zacatecas and Guanajuato. Combined, these American silver mines produced more precious metal than all previous human civilizations had extracted throughout recorded history. Spanish America wasn't just rich in silver. It contained silver deposits so vast that they challenged basic assumptions about currency and wealth. The scale defied comprehension. Between 1550 and 1650, American mines produced approximately 150,000 tons of silver. To visualize this amount, if you melted all that silver into a single block, it would weigh more than the Statue of Liberty and the Eiffel Tower combined. Spanish America was producing enough silver annually to mint currency for entire continents. Here's what made this discovery economically revolutionary. Before 1550, European silver supplies were limited and expensive. Silver coins were valuable precisely because silver was rare. European economies operated on metallic currency standards, where money's value was directly tied to the scarcity of precious metals. Spanish America destroyed this scarcity overnight. The Potosí mine alone was producing 1,000 tons of silver annually by 1580. That's equivalent to the entire world's silver production before American discovery. Every year, this single mountain was doubling global silver availability. Spanish treasure fleets were transporting so much silver to Europe that they were accidentally conducting a continent-wide experiment in monetary expansion. But extracting this silver required creating the most brutal industrial operation in human history. Spanish colonial authorities implemented the mita system, a forced labor draft that required indigenous communities to provide workers for silver mines. Every seventh adult male from indigenous communities within 200 miles of Potosí was required to spend 4 months annually working in the mines. This wasn't employment. This was systematic enslavement disguised as taxation. The working conditions were deliberately lethal. Potosí mine shafts extended 750 feet underground through unstable rock formations. Workers descended into the mines using rope ladders, then spent 12-hour shifts extracting silver ore with basic tools in spaces with minimal ventilation. Cave-ins were routine. Toxic mercury used in silver processing poisoned workers gradually. Most forced laborers died within 2 years of beginning mine work. Conservative estimates suggest that 8 million people died in American silver mines between 1545 and 1650. Most were indigenous Americans, but Spanish colonial authorities also imported African slaves and European indentured servants to maintain workforce levels as local populations died off. The Cerro Rico became known as the mountain that eats men. It produced incredible wealth by consuming human lives at industrial scale. Spanish colonial records from the period reveal the calculating cruelty of this system. Colonial administrators tracked worker death rates not because they cared about human costs, but because they needed to plan labor replacement schedules. When indigenous populations near mines declined through death and disease, Spanish authorities expanded the geographic range of forced labor recruitment. The mita system was designed to ensure continuous worker supplies regardless of mortality rates. This systematic murder was economically motivated, but also strategically necessary for Spanish imperial survival. By 1580, Spanish-European commitments required continuous silver imports to remain solvent. Spanish kings were using American treasure to fund wars against France, England, the Ottoman Empire, and various German states simultaneously. Spanish military operations across Europe, Africa, and Asia depended on regular treasure fleet deliveries from American mines. The mathematical relationship was straightforward but unsustainable. Spanish global operations required approximately 300 tons of silver annually, while Spanish domestic revenue could only support about 50 tons worth of expenses. Spanish America had to produce 250 tons of excess silver every year just to keep the Spanish Empire functional. This meant that American silver mines couldn't just be profitable, they had to be profitable enough to subsidize Spanish operations on 4 continents. Spanish colonial authorities responded to this pressure by maximizing extraction speed rather than extraction sustainability. They forced indigenous communities to increase silver production annually, regardless of long-term consequences for either human populations or mining infrastructure. The goal wasn't building sustainable American economies, it was extracting maximum wealth as quickly as possible to fund Spanish-European priorities. This extraction focus created several problems that wouldn't become obvious for decades. First, Spanish America was being systematically depopulated through mine deaths, disease, and forced migration. Indigenous American populations declined by approximately 90% between 1500 and 1650, mostly due to mining operations and associated diseases. Second, Spanish colonial territories were developing no economic diversity. Everything was subordinated to silver extraction, which meant that American colonies were becoming economically hollow, even while producing incredible wealth. But the most dangerous problem was what Spanish silver was doing to European markets. Every treasure fleet that arrived in Seville was dumping massive amounts of silver into European currency systems that couldn't absorb that much precious metal without significant inflation. Spanish treasure wasn't just making Spain wealthy, it was making European money less valuable. Spanish authorities noticed that goods were becoming more expensive across Europe, but they interpreted this as evidence of economic growth rather than understanding that their silver was causing currency devaluation. Spanish kings saw rising prices as prosperity indicators, not realizing that Spanish treasure was accidentally creating Europe's first sustained inflation crisis. The irony was profound. Spanish America was producing so much silver that it was devaluing silver as a currency base, which meant that Spain was getting less real value from each ton of silver extracted. The more successful Spanish mining became, the less valuable Spanish success actually was in economic terms. By 1600, American silver mines were producing wealth equivalent to 25% of European GDP annually. But this wealth was also causing price increases that made basic goods more expensive for everyone in Europe, including Spanish people. Spanish treasure was simultaneously making Spain the richest nation in history and making Spanish citizens poorer in real terms. Spanish Silver Mountain discoveries were genuine miracles of resource abundance that provided Spain with economic advantages unprecedented in human history. They were also economic weapons of mass destruction that would eventually make Spain broker than they had been before Columbus sailed west. But in 1580, at peak silver production, Spanish success seemed infinite and permanent. The mountains contained enough silver to fund Spanish global operations for centuries. Spanish mining technology was extracting silver faster than anyone thought physically possible. Spanish treasure fleets were successfully transporting this wealth across dangerous oceans despite pirate attacks and naval warfare. Spain controlled the largest flow of liquid wealth in world history, and they were planning to increase production even further. The Spanish Silver Mountains were about to flood Europe with treasure beyond imagination and accidentally destroy the Spanish Empire in the process. Chapter 4. Treasure Highways. Moving 300 tons of silver annually from Bolivian mountains to Spanish ports required creating the world's most dangerous transportation network. The Spanish treasure highway system stretched 5,000 miles from Potosí to Seville, crossing some of the most challenging terrain on Earth. Silver extracted from Bolivian mines had to travel by llama caravan across the Andes Mountains, then by ship along the Pacific coast to Panama, then by mule train across the Panama Isthmus, then by treasure fleet across the Atlantic to Spain. Every step was vulnerable to attack, weather, and mechanical failure, but the Spanish made this impossible logistics work through systematic brutality and overwhelming military force. The journey began in Potosí, where refined silver was cast into standardized bars weighing approximately 140 pounds each. These bars were specifically designed for transportation, heavy enough to maximize cargo value per shipment, but light enough for single animals to carry across mountain terrain. Spanish colonial authorities marked each bar with official stamps indicating silver purity, weight, and tax status. Transporting unmarked silver was punishable by death. From Potosí, silver caravans traveled 1,200 miles northwest to Lima, Peru. This route crossed the Altiplano, a high-altitude plateau averaging 12,000 feet above sea level, with temperatures that regularly dropped below freezing and oxygen levels that could kill unaccustomed travelers. The caravans consisted of 500 to 1,000 llamas carrying silver bars, protected by armed guards and accompanied by indigenous porters who knew the mountain routes. These mountain crossings took 6 weeks under ideal conditions, but conditions were rarely ideal. Altitude sickness disabled Spanish guards unfamiliar with high-elevation travel. Mountain weather changed rapidly, creating snowstorms that could bury entire caravans. Indigenous populations occasionally attacked silver caravans as acts of resistance against Spanish colonial extraction. More commonly, Spanish guards died from exposure, leaving silver shipments vulnerable to theft by opportunistic raiders. Spanish authorities responded to these challenges by implementing the most comprehensive security system ever created for commercial transportation. Every silver caravan included at least 50 armed guards, emergency supply caches, backup routes, and advanced scouts who checked for potential threats. Spanish colonial government spent approximately 10% of silver shipment value on transportation security, a massive expense that reduced the profitability of American mining, but was absolutely necessary for getting treasure safely to European markets. Once silver caravans reached Lima, the logistics became even more complex. Lima served as the primary Pacific coast shipping port for South American treasure, but getting silver from Lima to Atlantic shipping required crossing the entire South American continent. Spanish authorities had 2 route options: sailing around Cape Horn at the southern tip of South America, or using the Panama Land Bridge to transfer treasure from Pacific to Atlantic shipping. The Cape Horn route was longer but entirely maritime. Spanish ships could load silver in Lima, sail 3,000 miles south around South America's dangerous southern coast, then 3,000 miles north through the Atlantic to reach Caribbean treasure fleet assembly points. This route took 6 months under favorable conditions and required Spanish ships to navigate some of the most dangerous waters in the world. Cape Horn's combination of strong currents, unpredictable weather, and rocky coastlines had destroyed hundreds of ships attempting the passage. But the Panama route, while shorter, required even more complex coordination. Spanish ships loaded with silver had to sail from Lima to Panama's Pacific coast, then transfer their cargo to mule trains for overland transport across the Panama Isthmus. This 50-mile journey across jungle terrain took 2 weeks and required approximately 2,000 mules to transport a typical silver shipment. Spanish authorities built fortified waypoints across the isthmus to protect silver during overland transport. But these facilities required permanent garrisons and regular supply shipments. Once silver reached Panama's Atlantic coast, it was loaded onto Caribbean-based ships for transport to Havana, Cuba, where South American treasure would be combined with Mexican silver for the final voyage to Spain. This transfer process created multiple points of vulnerability, where Spanish treasure was temporarily stored in colonial ports, making it vulnerable to pirate raids or enemy naval attacks. Mexican silver followed a different but equally dangerous route. Silver from mines in Zacatecas and Guanajuato traveled by mule train to Mexico City, then continued to Veracruz on Mexico's Atlantic coast. This 300-mile journey crossed volcanic terrain, tropical forests, and regions controlled by indigenous groups that remained hostile to Spanish colonial presence. Mexican silver caravans faced constant threats from bandits, environmental hazards, and occasional indigenous attacks. From Veracruz, Mexican silver was loaded onto Caribbean shipping for transport to Havana. This Caribbean voyage was theoretically safer than Pacific or Atlantic crossings, but Caribbean waters were infested with pirates, specifically targeting Spanish treasure ships. English, French, Dutch, and independent pirates had established bases throughout the Caribbean islands, creating a permanent threat to Spanish shipping routes. The most dangerous phase of the entire journey was the final Atlantic crossing from Havana to Seville. Spanish treasure fleets departing Havana carried the combined silver wealth of Mexican and South American mines, shipments worth millions of pesos and representing months of production from dozens of mining operations. These fleets were massive, slow-moving, and extremely valuable, making them perfect targets for enemy naval forces. Spanish authorities protected treasure fleets with dedicated warships called galleons, floating fortresses carrying 30-50 cannons and 300-500 armed men. These galleons were specifically designed for treasure protection rather than speed or cargo capacity. They could fight off most pirate attacks and provide security for merchant ships carrying silver, but they also made treasure fleets even slower and more expensive to operate. The Atlantic crossing took 8 to 12 weeks depending on weather and route selection. Spanish treasure fleets had to navigate around enemy-controlled territories, avoid seasonal hurricane zones, and maintain defensive formations that sacrificed speed for security. During wartime, Spanish fleets had to be prepared for naval battles against enemy squadrons specifically deployed to intercept Spanish treasure. But even successful treasure transportation created new problems for Spanish economic management. When Spanish treasure fleets reached Seville, they dumped massive amounts of silver into European markets, faster than those markets could absorb the precious metal without significant inflation. Spanish treasure highways were so efficient at moving American silver to Europe that they were accidentally destabilizing European currency systems. The transportation costs were also becoming unsustainable. By 1600, Spanish authorities were spending approximately 2 million pesos annually on treasure highway maintenance, security, and logistics. This represented about 15% of total American silver production, a massive expense that reduced Spanish profit margins from colonial mining operations. More problematically, the Spanish treasure highway system was becoming increasingly vulnerable to systematic disruption. Enemy nations were learning to target Spanish transportation infrastructure rather than just attacking individual treasure ships. Destroying Spanish ports, blocking overland routes, or capturing key transportation hubs could disrupt Spanish treasure flows for months, creating cash flow crises for Spanish European operations. The Spanish response to these vulnerabilities was to increase military spending on transportation security, which further reduced the net value of American silver, while making Spanish operations more dependent on continuous treasure imports. Spanish authorities were trapped in an expensive cycle where protecting their wealth required spending increasing portions of that wealth on protection systems. By 1620, the Spanish treasure highway system was a logistical masterpiece that successfully moved more wealth across greater distances than any transportation network in human history. But it was also an economic liability that consumed enormous resources while making Spanish operations vulnerable to disruption at multiple points across 3 continents. Spanish treasure highways were simultaneously Spanish America's greatest achievement and Spanish Empire's greatest weakness. They proved that Spanish logistics could accomplish seemingly impossible tasks, but they also demonstrated that Spanish success was built on unsustainable foundations that would eventually collapse under their own complexity. But in 1600, at peak efficiency, Spanish treasure highways were successfully transporting wealth equivalent to multiple European nations' GDP annually from American mines to Spanish ports. The system was working perfectly, and perfectly setting up Spanish economic destruction through its own success. Chapter 5. European flooding between 1550 and 1650. Spanish treasure fleets dumped enough silver into European markets to triple the continent's money supply. This wasn't gradual economic change. This was monetary shock therapy on a continental scale. European economies had operated for centuries on limited precious metal supplies where silver was genuinely rare and valuable. Spanish America destroyed that rarity in less than a century, flooding European markets with so much silver that the fundamental relationship between money and value broke down across multiple countries simultaneously. The numbers are staggering. Before 1500, Europe's total silver supply was approximately 3,600 tons, accumulated over centuries of mining and trade. Between 1500 and 1650, Spanish treasure fleets imported 16,000 tons of American silver into European markets. Spanish America increased European silver availability by 450% in 150 years. But this silver didn't distribute evenly across Europe. Spanish treasure fleets delivered their cargo directly to Seville, creating massive silver concentrations in Spanish markets that then spread gradually to other European regions through trade and commerce. This created a silver inflation wave that began in Spain, then swept across European trade networks like a slow-motion economic tsunami. Spanish authorities initially interpreted rising prices as evidence of economic prosperity. When bread costs doubled in Spanish cities between 1550 and 1600, Spanish economists concluded that Spanish wealth was driving economic growth. When luxury goods became more expensive across European markets, Spanish leaders believed that Spanish silver was creating continent-wide prosperity. They were completely wrong. Spanish silver was causing systematic currency devaluation across European economies by increasing money supply faster than economic production. Every ounce of Spanish silver that entered European markets reduced the purchasing power of existing European currency. Spanish treasure wasn't creating prosperity, it was making everyone's money worth less in real terms. The inflation pattern followed Spanish trade routes precisely. Cities with direct access to Spanish silver experienced rapid price increases first, then inflation spread to surrounding regions as Spanish silver dispersed through commercial networks. Venice, Hamburg, Amsterdam, and London, major European trading centers that conducted regular business with Spanish merchants, all experienced significant price increases within decades of Spanish silver arrival. But Spain experienced the worst inflation because Spain received the concentrated silver inflow before it dispersed to other European markets. Spanish prices increased faster than European averages, making basic goods more expensive for Spanish citizens, even though Spain controlled the silver supply, causing the price increases. Spanish people were getting poorer in real terms, despite Spanish America producing unprecedented wealth. Here's the twisted irony. Spanish silver was making Spanish enemies richer, while making Spanish people poorer. English, French, and Dutch merchants who traded with Spanish America could acquire Spanish silver through commerce, then use that silver in their domestic markets, where prices hadn't yet adjusted to increased silver supply. Foreign merchants were profiting from Spanish inflation, while Spanish citizens suffered from it. Dutch and English merchants quickly figured out this arbitrage opportunity. They could purchase goods in their domestic markets using traditional currency, then sell those same goods in Spanish markets for Spanish silver, then use that silver to purchase more goods in their home countries at lower prices. Spanish inflation was subsidizing foreign commercial profits while making Spanish domestic trade less competitive. The geographic pattern of European inflation reveals how completely Spanish silver reshaped continental economics. Spain experienced approximately 400% price increases between 1500 and 1650. France, with significant Spanish trade connections, experienced about 250% price increases. England, more isolated from Spanish commerce, experienced roughly 200% price increases. Even countries with minimal Spanish contact, like Poland and Sweden, experienced 150% price increases as Spanish silver spread through European trade networks. But Spanish authorities didn't understand that their silver was causing these price increases. 16th century economic theory couldn't explain sustained inflation because sustained inflation had never existed before Spanish-American treasure. European economists had no theoretical framework for understanding how increased money supply could reduce currency value across multiple countries simultaneously. Spanish intellectuals like Juan de Mariana and Martín de Azpilicueta began developing early inflation theory in response to Spanish price increases, but their insights came too late to influence Spanish policy. By the time Spanish economists understood that Spanish silver was causing European inflation, Spanish economic commitments required continuous treasure imports to remain solvent. Spain couldn't stop flooding European markets with silver without causing immediate Spanish bankruptcy. This created a vicious cycle. Spanish silver caused European inflation, which made Spanish goods more expensive, which reduced Spanish competitiveness in European markets, which made Spain more dependent on silver imports to maintain living standards. Spanish treasure was simultaneously making Spain wealthy and making Spanish economy uncompetitive. The European response to Spanish silver flooding varied by country and created complex international economic relationships. England and France began developing domestic industries specifically to compete with Spanish imports, taking advantage of Spanish inflation to make their own goods more competitive in European markets. The Dutch focused on maritime commerce, using their naval capabilities to intercept Spanish silver through trade rather than domestic production. German states, particularly those controlling Central European silver mines, initially benefited from increased silver demand caused by Spanish inflation. But American silver production eventually overwhelmed European mining operations, making German silver mines unprofitable compared to American imports. Spanish treasure destroyed European silver mining as effectively as it destroyed Spanish domestic industries. The most sophisticated European response came from Italian banking houses, particularly in Florence and Genoa. Italian bankers recognized that Spanish inflation created opportunities for currency arbitrage and international credit operations. They established banking networks that could move money between European cities faster than price adjustments could spread, allowing them to profit from inflation differentials across European markets. Italian banks also became major creditors to Spanish kings, who needed loans to fund European military operations between treasure fleet arrivals. This created the paradox where Spanish treasure was indirectly financing Spanish enemies through Italian banking intermediaries, who used Spanish silver to fund anti-Spanish coalitions. But the most damaging long-term consequence of European silver flooding was what economists now call Dutch disease, when resource wealth makes other economic sectors uncompetitive. Spanish silver made Spanish agriculture and manufacturing economically inefficient compared to importing goods from countries with lower price levels. Spanish treasure was accidentally destroying Spanish productivity. By 1620, Spain was importing food from France, textiles from the Netherlands, manufactured goods from England, and luxury items from Italy. Spanish domestic production couldn't compete with foreign imports when Spanish citizens had access to silver that was still scarce in foreign markets. Spanish America was producing incredible wealth, but Spanish Europe was becoming economically hollow. European silver flooding also created military vulnerabilities for Spanish operations. Spanish enemies could use Spanish inflation against Spanish military effectiveness by targeting Spanish supply lines and forcing Spain to purchase military supplies in inflated Spanish markets. English and French forces could operate more efficiently than Spanish armies, because they had access to lower price levels in their domestic economies. The continental scope of Spanish silver impact demonstrates how completely Spanish treasure reshaped European economic relationships. No European country remained unaffected by Spanish-American silver, but no European country benefited as much from Spanish silver as Spanish enemies did. Spanish treasure was creating the wealth that would eventually fund Spanish destruction. European flooding with Spanish silver was the first example in human history of one country's resource abundance causing systematic economic problems for multiple nations simultaneously. Spanish treasure didn't just affect Spanish markets. It restructured European economics in ways that made Spanish military and economic dominance ultimately unsustainable. But in 1600, at peak silver flow, Spanish flooding of European markets seemed like unlimited prosperity that would continue forever. Spanish treasure fleets were delivering wealth that exceeded most European nations' entire economies annually. European markets were adapting to increased silver availability by expanding commercial operations and developing new financial instruments. Spanish silver flooding was creating the economic conditions that would eventually destroy Spanish dominance, but those conditions also enabled the most extensive global trade networks in human history. Spanish treasure was simultaneously building and demolishing the Spanish Empire. Chapter 6. Price Revolution. By 1600, a loaf of bread in Madrid cost 4 times more than the same bread in London. This wasn't because Spanish bread was superior. This was because Spanish silver had broken Spanish prices. Historians call this the Price Revolution, Europe's first sustained inflation crisis, caused entirely by Spanish treasure imports from the Americas. Between 1500 and 1650, European prices increased by 300–400% on average, with Spanish prices rising fastest and highest. But Spanish authorities didn't understand. They were witnessing history's first experiment in hyperinflation caused by precious metal oversupply. The mathematical relationship was straightforward but invisible to contemporary observers. Every ton of Spanish silver that entered European markets increased the European money supply without increasing European production capacity. More money chasing the same amount of goods inevitably created price increases, but 16th century economic theory had no framework for understanding systematic inflation caused by monetary expansion. Spanish intellectuals noticed that prices were rising across Europe, but they interpreted this phenomenon as evidence of European economic growth rather than understanding that Spanish silver was devaluing European currency. Spanish economists believed that rising prices indicated prosperity, more demand for goods, more commercial activity, more wealth circulation. They were completely wrong. What Spanish authorities failed to recognize was that their silver was creating artificial demand by increasing purchasing power without increasing production capacity. Spanish silver allowed people to bid higher prices for existing goods, but it didn't create more goods to satisfy that increased demand. Spanish treasure was causing price competition without productivity growth. The price revolution affected different goods and different regions with varying intensity, creating complex economic distortions across European markets. Basic necessities like bread, meat, and housing experienced the most dramatic price increases because demand for these goods was relatively inelastic. People needed food and shelter regardless of price, so they continued purchasing even as costs increased dramatically. Luxury goods experienced smaller price increases because demand was more elastic. When luxury items became more expensive, people could choose not to purchase them. This created a regressive inflation pattern where basic living costs increased faster than luxury costs, making the price revolution particularly damaging for European working populations. Geographic location also determined inflation impact. Cities with direct access to Spanish silver, Seville, Barcelona, Naples, Genoa, experienced the most rapid and severe price increases. Rural areas and regions with limited Spanish trade connections experienced slower, but still significant inflation, as Spanish silver gradually dispersed through European commercial networks. Spain itself suffered the worst price revolution effects because Spanish markets received concentrated silver inflows before prices had time to adjust to increased money supply. Spanish cities experienced inflation rates of 400–500% between 1500 and 1650, making basic goods prohibitively expensive for Spanish citizens, despite Spain controlling unprecedented silver wealth. This created the central paradox of Spanish economic success. Spanish America was producing more wealth than any territory in human history, but Spanish people were becoming poorer in real terms because Spanish wealth was making Spanish prices unaffordable. Spanish silver was simultaneously enriching and impoverishing Spain, but the price revolution's most damaging consequence was how it affected Spanish international competitiveness. Spanish inflation made Spanish goods more expensive than equivalent foreign products, encouraging Spanish consumers to purchase imports rather than domestic goods. Spanish agriculture became uncompetitive compared to French imports. Spanish manufacturing became uneconomical compared to Dutch and English production. Spanish authorities initially welcomed this import pattern because it seemed to demonstrate Spanish prosperity. Spanish people could afford foreign luxury goods that other Europeans couldn't purchase. Spanish leaders interpreted heavy import consumption as evidence of Spanish economic superiority, rather than recognizing it as evidence of Spanish economic hollowing. The reality was more complex and more dangerous. Spanish import dependency was increasing Spanish vulnerability to trade disruptions while destroying Spanish domestic production capacity. Spanish agriculture was declining because importing food seemed cheaper when Spain controlled unlimited silver. Spanish manufacturing was disappearing because foreign goods appeared more affordable in inflated Spanish markets. This created what economists now call Dutch disease, when resource wealth makes other economic sectors uncompetitive. Spanish silver abundance was accidentally destroying Spanish economic diversity by making non-silver activities economically inefficient compared to simply importing goods from countries with lower price levels. Spanish authorities compounded this problem by using American silver to fund military operations across Europe, Asia, and Africa simultaneously. Spanish imperial commitments required approximately 12 million ducats annually by 1600, while Spanish domestic revenue could only provide about 2 million ducats without American silver supplements. Spanish global operations were completely dependent on continuous treasure imports from American mines. This dependency created a vicious cycle. Spanish military spending fueled additional inflation by putting more silver into European circulation, which made Spanish goods even less competitive internationally, which increased Spanish import dependency, which required more silver imports to maintain Spanish living standards. Spanish success was feeding Spanish economic destruction. The price revolution also affected European labor markets in ways that damaged Spanish economic development. Spanish inflation made Spanish wages artificially high compared to other European countries, but Spanish productivity didn't increase proportionally. Spanish workers were expensive, but not necessarily more skilled or efficient than foreign workers. Foreign merchants could exploit this wage differential by purchasing goods in low-inflation countries, then selling those goods in high-inflation Spanish markets at profits that exceeded normal commercial margins. Spanish inflation was subsidizing foreign commercial operations while making Spanish domestic businesses uncompetitive. Dutch and English merchants developed sophisticated arbitrage strategies based on European price differentials created by Spanish silver. They could purchase manufactured goods in Amsterdam or London, transport them to Spanish markets, sell them at inflated Spanish prices, then use the Spanish silver to purchase more goods in their home countries at lower prices. Spanish inflation was funding foreign economic development. Italian banking houses became particularly skilled at exploiting price revolution opportunities. Italian bankers established credit networks that could move money between European cities faster than price adjustments could spread, allowing them to profit from temporary price differentials across European markets. Italian banks used Spanish silver to develop financial instruments that competed directly with Spanish economic operations. But the most dangerous aspect of the price revolution was how it made Spanish economic planning impossible. Spanish authorities couldn't predict future costs for military operations, infrastructure projects, or administrative expenses because Spanish prices were changing too rapidly for accurate budgeting. Spanish inflation made long-term economic strategy impossible, Spanish military operations suffered particularly severe consequences from price revolution effects. Spanish armies operating in European theaters faced constantly increasing supply costs, while Spanish enemies could field equivalent forces at lower expenses in their domestic markets. Spanish inflation was making Spanish military operations progressively more expensive relative to foreign military capabilities. The price revolution also created social tensions within Spanish territories, as different populations experienced inflation differently. Spanish nobility with access to American silver could maintain purchasing power despite rising prices, while Spanish workers with fixed wages experienced declining living standards. Spanish treasure was increasing Spanish inequality while reducing Spanish economic efficiency. By 1620, the price revolution had fundamentally restructured European economic relationships in ways that favored Spanish enemies over Spanish interests. English, French, and Dutch economies had adapted to Spanish-caused inflation by developing domestic industries that could compete effectively with Spanish imports. Spanish treasure was financing the economic development of future Spanish rivals. The price revolution represents history's first example of resource abundance, causing systematic economic problems for the resource-controlling country. Spanish silver created prosperity that was distributed more effectively to Spanish enemies than to Spanish citizens. Spanish treasure was the fuel that powered Spanish imperial expansion and the poison that made Spanish imperial expansion unsustainable. But Spanish authorities didn't recognize these problems because contemporary economic theory couldn't explain how wealth could cause poverty. Spanish economists saw rising prices as evidence of economic dynamism rather than understanding that Spanish silver was causing currency devaluation across European markets. The price revolution was simultaneously the golden age of Spanish prosperity and the beginning of Spanish economic collapse. Spanish America was producing unprecedented wealth, but that wealth was restructuring European economics in ways that made Spanish dominance temporary rather than permanent. Spanish silver had successfully broken European economics, but it had also broken Spanish economic sustainability. The price revolution was Spanish imperial success and Spanish imperial suicide disguised as the same phenomenon. Chapter 7. Economic suicide. In 1557, the Spanish Empire, controller of the world's largest silver supply, declared bankruptcy for the first time. This wasn't supposed to be possible. Spain controlled American mines producing 80% of global silver output. Spanish treasure fleets were transporting wealth equivalent to multiple European nations' entire economies annually. Spain had access to more liquid wealth than any country in human history. How do you go bankrupt when you own unlimited money? The answer reveals the twisted logic of Spanish economic suicide. Spanish wealth was making Spanish survival impossible. Philip II, King of Spain from 1556 to 1598, inherited an empire that controlled territories on 4 continents and treasure flows beyond imagination. Philip also inherited financial commitments that exceeded even American silver production. Spanish-European wars, Mediterranean naval operations, American colonial administration, and Asian trade networks required approximately 12 million ducats annually. Spanish America was producing roughly 8 million ducats worth of silver per year. Simple mathematics. Spanish expenses exceeded Spanish income by 4 million ducats annually, even with unlimited silver imports. Spanish global operations were so extensive that they cost more than the largest treasure supply in human history could fund. Spanish success was literally more expensive than Spanish wealth. But Philip II's response wasn't to reduce Spanish commitments. It was to increase borrowing using future American silver as collateral. Spanish kings began selling future treasure fleet deliveries to Italian and German bankers at discounted rates, receiving immediate cash for military operations, while mortgaging future silver imports to repay loans with interest. This financial strategy created several catastrophic problems. First, Spanish authorities were spending American silver before it was extracted from American mines, creating dependency on continuous mining production at maximum output levels. Second, Spanish borrowing terms required interest payments that exceeded the face value of loans, meaning Spain was paying more for money than they received from treasure imports. Third, Spanish loan guarantees were denominated in silver, but Spanish military expenses were denominated in various European currencies, creating exchange rate vulnerabilities that could multiply Spanish financial obligations unexpectedly. The 1557 bankruptcy was the first demonstration of these problems, but not the last. Spain declared bankruptcy again in 1575, 1596, 1607, 1627, and 1647. Each bankruptcy represented the same fundamental issue. Spanish expenses consistently exceeded Spanish income, despite Spanish control of unprecedented wealth. Spanish America was producing treasure fast enough to fund any individual European nation, but not fast enough to fund Spanish operations on 4 continents simultaneously. Spanish authorities treated each bankruptcy as a temporary financial crisis, rather than recognizing systematic problems with Spanish economic strategy. Spanish kings would negotiate debt restructuring with creditors, then resume identical spending patterns that guaranteed future financial crises. Spanish economic policy was deliberately designed to maximize short-term capability while ensuring long-term bankruptcy. The deeper problem was that Spanish wealth was preventing Spanish authorities from developing sustainable economic policies. Spanish kings had access to American silver that could solve immediate financial problems, so they never developed economic strategies based on Spanish domestic production capacity. Spanish authorities treated American treasure as infinite resource that could fund unlimited expenses, rather than understanding that even unprecedented wealth had limits. Spanish military operations provide the clearest example of this economic suicide logic. Spanish armies operated simultaneously in the Netherlands, France, Italy, Germany, North Africa, the Philippines, and various American territories. Spanish naval forces maintained combat readiness in the Atlantic, Pacific, Mediterranean, and Indian Oceans simultaneously. Spanish military commitments required more resources than most countries could deploy to a single theater, but Spain was attempting to maintain dominance globally. These military operations were strategically rational, but economically impossible. Spanish enemies could concentrate their resources against Spanish forces in individual regions, while Spain had to defend territories scattered across 4 continents. Spanish military expenditure per soldier was higher than equivalent foreign military costs because Spanish supply lines were longer, Spanish logistics were more complex, and Spanish operations were conducted in regions where Spanish prices had been inflated by Spanish silver imports. Spanish authorities compounded this problem by using military success to justify additional territorial acquisitions that required even more military spending. Spanish conquest of Portugal in 1580 added Portuguese territories in Brazil, Africa, and Asia to Spanish defensive commitments. Spanish victories against French forces encouraged Spanish expansion into additional European theaters. Spanish success was consistently increasing Spanish costs faster than Spanish success was increasing Spanish capabilities. But the most damaging aspect of Spanish economic suicide was how American silver dependency prevented Spanish domestic economic development. Spanish authorities focused on maximizing treasure extraction from American mines rather than developing sustainable economic production in Spanish territories. Spanish America was treated as a treasure source rather than a potential economic region, while Spanish Europe was treated as a military headquarters rather than a productive economy. Spanish agricultural production declined between 1550 and 1650 because importing food from France and other European countries seemed cheaper when Spain controlled unlimited silver. Spanish manufacturing disappeared because purchasing foreign goods appeared more cost-effective than developing Spanish industrial capacity. Spanish domestic economy was becoming hollow while Spanish foreign wealth was increasing. This created dangerous vulnerabilities in Spanish economic sustainability. Spanish living standards depended on continuous imports funded by continuous American silver production. If American mines ever reduced output, or if Spanish treasure fleets were disrupted, Spanish domestic economy couldn't support Spanish population at current living standards. Spanish prosperity was completely artificial, dependent on external resource extraction rather than internal economic production. Spanish authorities recognized these vulnerabilities in theory, but consistently chose short-term solutions that worsened long-term problems. When American silver production declined after 1620, Spanish response was to increase mining pressure on remaining American mines rather than developing alternative economic strategies. When Spanish inflation made Spanish goods uncompetitive, Spanish authorities increased import dependency rather than addressing price problems. Spanish policy was systematically self-destructive. The bankruptcy pattern reveals how completely Spanish wealth had corrupted Spanish economic judgment. Each Spanish financial crisis was followed by temporary reforms that reduced Spanish expenses and reorganized Spanish debt obligations. But Spanish access to American silver made these reforms politically unsustainable because Spanish leaders could always choose to resume expensive policies using treasure imports to fund immediate needs. Spanish authorities never developed economic strategies based on Spanish domestic capacity, because Spanish domestic capacity was irrelevant as long as American mines continued producing silver at maximum output. Spanish kings could ignore Spanish agricultural decline, Spanish manufacturing collapse, and Spanish trade deficits because American treasure could fund imports that replaced Spanish production. But American silver production wasn't infinite, and Spanish expenses were accelerating faster than American treasure imports. By 1620, Spanish authorities were spending future treasure fleet deliveries 5 years in advance, creating financial obligations that exceeded projected American silver production through 1630. Spanish economic suicide was approaching mathematical completion. Spanish enemies understood Spanish economic vulnerabilities better than Spanish authorities did. English, French, and Dutch leaders recognized that Spanish power depended entirely on American silver flows, so they began targeting Spanish treasure transportation rather than Spanish territories directly. Disrupting Spanish treasure fleets was more effective than conquering Spanish territories because it could cause Spanish financial collapse without requiring extended military campaigns. The 1628 Dutch capture of the Spanish treasure fleet represented the logical culmination of anti-Spanish economic warfare. Dutch forces didn't need to invade Spanish America or attack Spanish Europe. They just needed to intercept Spanish silver for a single year to cause Spanish financial crisis. Spanish wealth had become Spanish weakness. Spanish economic suicide wasn't accidental. It was the inevitable result of treating unlimited wealth as permanent resource rather than recognizing that even unprecedented abundance required sustainable management. Spanish authorities consistently chose policies that maximized short-term Spanish capability while ensuring long-term Spanish collapse. By 1640, Spanish America was still producing massive silver outputs. Spanish territories still controlled 4 continents, and Spanish military forces still dominated most theaters where they operated. But Spanish economic foundations had been systematically destroyed by Spanish wealth. Spanish success had been transformed into Spanish liability through consistent policy choices that prioritized immediate gratification over sustainable development. Spanish economic suicide was complete before Spanish political collapse became visible. Spanish bankruptcy wasn't a dramatic event. It was a slow-motion destruction that took 150 years to accomplish, disguised as prosperity until the final moment when Spanish illusions could no longer be sustained. Chapter 8. Pirate Wars. In 1628, Dutch Admiral Piet Hein accomplished what Spanish enemies had dreamed about for decades. He captured an entire Spanish treasure fleet intact. The seizure occurred near Matanzas Bay, Cuba, where Hein's squadron intercepted the combined Mexican and South American treasure fleets carrying their annual cargo to Spain. The captured silver totaled 11.5 million guilders, enough wealth to fund Dutch military operations for 8 months, pay Dutch government expenses for an entire year, and seriously damage Spanish European financial commitments. But this wasn't just a successful pirate raid. This was the culmination of a century-long economic war where Spanish enemies had learned to target Spanish treasure as the most effective method of attacking Spanish power. Spanish wealth had become Spanish vulnerability, and European pirates had transformed Spanish success into Spanish strategic weakness. The mathematics of pirate warfare against Spanish treasure were compelling for Spanish enemies. A successful attack on a Spanish treasure fleet could provide more wealth than most European nations collected in annual taxation. Spanish treasure ships carried cargo values equivalent to 10 to 20% of major European countries' entire economies. Capturing a single Spanish fleet could fund multiple years of military operations against Spanish interests. English privateers had recognized this opportunity early. Francis Drake's 1579 raid on Spanish Pacific shipping captured approximately 1 million pesos in silver, more wealth than English royal revenues for that entire year. Drake's success demonstrated that attacking Spanish treasure transportation was more profitable than traditional European warfare and significantly less expensive to organize. English authorities began issuing letters of marque that legitimized pirate attacks on Spanish shipping as acts of war rather than criminal activities. English privateers like Drake, Thomas Cavendish, and Walter Raleigh could attack Spanish treasure fleets with official English government support, then share captured wealth with English royal authorities. Piracy became English foreign policy. French corsairs adopted similar strategies, particularly after French-Spanish wars created formal hostilities that justified attacking Spanish shipping. French raiders based in Caribbean islands could intercept Spanish treasure fleets during their most vulnerable phases, when ships were heavily loaded with silver but hadn't yet assembled into full defensive convoys. But the most systematic anti-Spanish pirate operations came from the Dutch, who developed comprehensive strategies for disrupting Spanish treasure flows as part of their broader independence war against Spanish rule. Dutch naval forces weren't just conducting pirate raids, they were implementing economic warfare designed to destroy Spanish financial capability. The Dutch approach was strategically sophisticated. Rather than focusing on individual treasure ships, Dutch forces targeted Spanish treasure infrastructure. Dutch raiders attacked Spanish Caribbean ports, destroyed Spanish shipbuilding facilities, captured Spanish supply bases, and disrupted Spanish shipping schedules. Dutch strategy aimed to make Spanish treasure transportation so expensive and unreliable that Spanish economic operations would become unsustainable. Dutch Admiral Piet Hein's 1628 success represented the perfect execution of this strategy. Heine didn't just capture Spanish treasure, he captured an entire year's worth of Spanish-American silver production while demonstrating that Spanish treasure fleet protection was inadequate against determined enemy naval forces. Heine's raid proved that Spanish wealth could be systematically intercepted by Spanish enemies with superior naval tactics. The captured treasure provided the Dutch with immediate financial advantages, but the strategic implications were more important. Spanish authorities had to increase treasure fleet protection expenses, which reduced the net value of American silver imports. Spanish enemies had demonstrated that Spanish treasure flows were vulnerable to systematic interdiction, which made Spanish financial planning unreliable. Spanish wealth was becoming more expensive to protect and less certain to deliver. Spanish responses to pirate threats created additional economic problems. Spanish authorities increased treasure fleet security by adding more warships, larger crews, heavier armaments, and more frequent patrols. These security improvements were militarily necessary, but economically devastating, because they reduced Spanish profit margins from American silver while making Spanish operations more dependent on continuous treasure delivery. Spanish treasure fleet protection costs increased from approximately 10% of cargo value in 1550 to nearly 30% of cargo value by 1630. Spanish authorities were spending almost 1/3 of American silver production on protecting the remaining 2/3 during transportation to Europe. Spanish treasure was becoming less valuable because Spanish security requirements were consuming increasing portions of Spanish wealth. The geographic scope of pirate threats made Spanish defensive problems nearly impossible to solve. Spanish treasure routes extended from Bolivian mines to Spanish ports, thousands of miles across some of the most dangerous waters in the world. Spanish enemies could attack Spanish shipping at dozens of potential points, while Spanish forces had to protect treasure transportation across the entire route simultaneously. Caribbean waters were particularly dangerous because multiple European nations had established pirate bases throughout the Caribbean islands. English forces controlled Jamaica and various smaller islands. French raiders operated from Tortuga and Martinique. Dutch pirates used Curaçao and Sint Maarten as operational bases. Spanish treasure fleets had to navigate through waters where Spanish enemies maintained permanent naval presence, specifically designed to intercept Spanish shipping. But pirates weren't just stealing Spanish treasure. They were using captured Spanish silver to fund additional anti-Spanish operations. English privateers used Spanish treasure to purchase ships, weapons, and supplies for expanded raiding operations against Spanish targets. Dutch forces used captured Spanish silver to fund their independence war against Spanish rule. French corsairs used Spanish wealth to support French military operations against Spanish territories. Spanish treasure was literally funding Spanish destruction through pirate intermediaries. Every successful raid against Spanish shipping provided Spanish enemies with resources to organize additional attacks on Spanish interests. Spanish wealth was creating a self-reinforcing cycle where Spanish success enabled Spanish enemies to attack Spanish operations more effectively. The most damaging long-term consequence of pirate warfare was how it affected Spanish colonial development. Spanish authorities responded to pirate threats by concentrating American silver production in heavily fortified locations that could be defended more easily, rather than developing diverse economic activities across Spanish-American territories. Spanish America became even more focused on silver extraction because other economic activities seemed too vulnerable to pirate disruption. Spanish colonial agriculture, manufacturing, and commerce declined because Spanish authorities prioritized activities that could be protected more effectively. Pirate threats were making Spanish America economically hollow even while silver production remained high. Spanish colonial cities became fortress towns designed for defense rather than economic development. Spanish-American ports required massive fortifications, permanent military garrisons, and expensive defensive infrastructure. Spanish colonies were becoming military installations rather than productive economic regions. The psychological impact of pirate success on Spanish morale was also significant. Spanish treasure fleets had represented Spanish invincibility, the ability to transport unprecedented wealth across dangerous oceans despite enemy opposition. Successful pirate attacks demonstrated that Spanish naval power wasn't invulnerable, which encouraged additional European challenges to Spanish dominance. Spanish authorities tried to address pirate threats through diplomatic negotiations, offering European enemies territorial concessions or commercial privileges in exchange for agreements to stop attacking Spanish treasure shipping. But these negotiations revealed Spanish weakness rather than resolving Spanish security problems, because Spanish willingness to negotiate indicated that pirate attacks were seriously damaging Spanish operations. By 1640, pirate warfare had transformed Spanish treasure from Spanish strength into Spanish liability. Spanish wealth was attracting more enemy attention than Spanish military forces could deflect. Spanish treasure transportation required more resources than Spanish treasure was worth in net terms. Spanish success had become Spanish vulnerability through enemy adaptation to Spanish capabilities. The pirate wars against Spanish treasure demonstrate how military success can become strategic weakness when enemies adapt to exploit the foundations of that success. Spanish treasure fleets were military and logistical achievements that enabled Spanish global dominance, but they also created systematic vulnerabilities that Spanish enemies could target more effectively than direct attacks on Spanish territories. Spanish pirate problems weren't solvable through additional military spending or improved naval technology. The fundamental issue was that Spanish prosperity depended on moving massive wealth across vast distances through waters controlled by Spanish enemies who had strong incentives to intercept Spanish shipping. Spanish economic strategy was inherently vulnerable to systematic disruption. Pirate warfare against Spanish treasure was economic warfare disguised as criminal activity. Spanish enemies had discovered that attacking Spanish wealth was more effective than attacking Spanish power directly. Spanish treasure fleets had become Spanish strategic weakness disguised as Spanish strategic strength. The pirate wars represent the moment when Spanish wealth definitively became Spanish liability. Spanish America was still producing unprecedented silver, but Spanish enemies were capturing enough Spanish treasure to fund systematic attacks on Spanish global operations. Spanish success was feeding Spanish destruction through pirate intermediaries who understood Spanish vulnerabilities better than Spanish authorities did. Chapter 9. Imperial Collapse. By 1640, the Spanish Empire controlled more territory than Rome at its peak, commanded the world's largest navy, and still received massive treasure shipments from American mines. But Spain was broke, rebellious, and rapidly losing control of territories they dominated for over a century. The collapse wasn't dramatic, it was mathematical. Spanish expenses consistently exceeded Spanish income, despite unprecedented wealth from American silver. Spanish global commitments required more resources than even the largest treasure supply in human history could sustain. Spanish imperial success had become economically impossible. The 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, demonstrates perfectly how Spanish wealth had become Spanish liability. This European religious conflict required Spain to fund massive military operations in Germany, while simultaneously defending Spanish territories in Italy, fighting independence movements in the Netherlands, maintaining naval dominance in the Mediterranean, protecting American colonies from pirate attacks, and administering territories across 4 continents. Spanish military expenses during the 30 Years' War averaged 15 million ducats annually, nearly double the total value of American silver imports even during peak production years. Spanish authorities were spending more on European warfare alone than Spanish America was producing in total treasure output. Spanish military commitments had exceeded Spanish economic capacity despite controlling unprecedented wealth. But Spanish authorities couldn't reduce military spending without losing territories that generated the tax revenue and strategic advantages that justified Spanish global empire. Spanish territories in Italy provided access to Mediterranean trade routes. Spanish control of the Netherlands generated commercial income and prevented hostile powers from establishing bases near Spanish coastlines. Spanish-American colonies produced the silver that funded all Spanish operations. Every Spanish territory was simultaneously essential for Spanish survival and too expensive for Spanish maintenance. Spanish global empire had become a collection of strategic necessities that collectively cost more than Spanish empire could afford to maintain. The Portuguese Restoration War, 1640-1668, reveals how Spanish economic problems were creating military vulnerabilities across Spanish territories. Portugal had been ruled by Spanish kings since 1580, providing Spain with access to Portuguese territories in Brazil, Africa, and Asia. Portuguese resources had supplemented Spanish global operations for 60 years. But Spanish financial crises during the 1630s required increased taxation on Portuguese territories to fund Spanish European military operations. Portuguese nobility rebelled against Spanish tax increases, declared Portuguese independence, and began fighting Spanish forces for control of Portuguese territories. Spain lost access to Portuguese resources precisely when Spanish financial problems made those resources most necessary. Spanish authorities couldn't afford to reconquer Portugal because Spanish military forces were already committed to operations in Germany, Italy, France, and the Netherlands simultaneously. Spanish Empire was too large to defend effectively when Spanish enemies coordinated attacks on multiple Spanish territories at the same time. The Catalan Revolt, 1640-1652, demonstrated similar problems within Spanish Europe itself. Catalonia was one of Spain's wealthiest and most productive regions, but Spanish tax demands to fund European warfare exceeded Catalan economic capacity. Catalan rebellion against Spanish taxation forced Spain to conduct military operations within Spanish territories using Spanish resources against Spanish subjects. Spanish authorities were spending American silver to fight Spanish citizens who were rebelling against Spanish policies designed to extract money for Spanish military operations against Spanish enemies who were attacking Spanish territories. Spanish wealth was funding Spanish military operations against Spanish populations who were resisting Spanish taxation intended to defend Spanish empire. The mathematical absurdity of Spanish imperial management had become undeniable. Spanish territories required more expensive defense than Spanish territories could afford to provide. Spanish global commitments consumed more resources than Spanish global resources could sustainably supply. Spanish Empire was systematically destroying itself through its own operational requirements. Spanish America itself was experiencing economic decline, despite continued silver production. Spanish colonial populations had been devastated by disease, mining deaths, and forced labor systems. Indigenous American populations had declined by approximately 90% since Spanish conquest, reducing the labor force available for both mining operations and agricultural production that supported colonial economies. Spanish colonial cities like Potosí and Mexico City remained wealthy during treasure fleet arrival seasons, but they were becoming economically hollow between fleet visits. Spanish America was developing no economic diversity beyond silver extraction, which meant that American territories were becoming increasingly vulnerable to disruption of mining operations or treasure transportation. American silver production itself was declining after 1620, as the most accessible ore deposits were exhausted, and mining operations required deeper excavations that were more expensive and dangerous. Spanish America was still producing massive silver outputs compared to historical standards, but production growth had stopped while Spanish expenses continued increasing. Spanish authorities responded to declining American production by increasing mining pressure on colonial populations, implementing more brutal forced labor systems, and expanding geographical areas subject to mining conscription. Spanish colonial policies were becoming more oppressive, precisely when Spanish colonial populations were least capable of sustaining increased exploitation. The Dutch capture of northeast Brazil, 1630-1654, illustrates how Spanish economic problems were creating military vulnerabilities across Spanish territories worldwide. Dutch forces could capture and hold Portuguese Spanish territory in South America because Spanish military resources were concentrated in European theaters. Spanish global empire was too extensive to defend comprehensively when multiple Spanish enemies attacked simultaneously. Spanish naval power, which had dominated global shipping for over a century, was declining due to economic pressures that prevented adequate ship maintenance and replacement. Spanish treasure fleets were becoming smaller and less frequent because Spanish authorities couldn't afford to maintain the extensive naval infrastructure required for comprehensive treasure protection. English and Dutch naval capabilities were improving relative to Spanish naval power because English and Dutch domestic economies could support sustained military spending without depending on external resource extraction. Spanish enemies were developing economic sustainability, while Spanish prosperity remained completely dependent on continuous American treasure imports. The Peace of Westphalia, 1648, ended the 30 Years' War with Spanish territorial concessions that acknowledged Spanish inability to maintain previous levels of European dominance. Spain formally recognized Dutch independence, accepted French territorial gains, and abandoned attempts to restore Catholic dominance in German territories. Spanish authorities were acknowledging military defeat due to economic exhaustion. But Spanish economic problems weren't resolved by ending European warfare. Spanish imperial commitments still required more resources than Spanish domestic production could provide. Spanish territories still needed expensive defense against hostile neighbors. Spanish America still required massive investments in mining infrastructure and treasure transportation systems. Spanish authorities began selling American territories to foreign powers to raise immediate cash for military operations in remaining Spanish territories. Spanish Empire was being liquidated piece by piece to fund the defense of Spanish Empire's remaining pieces. Spanish global dominance was consuming itself through its own maintenance requirements. The most tragic irony of Spanish imperial collapse was that it occurred while Spanish America was still producing unprecedented wealth. Spanish territories in 1650 still controlled the largest silver deposits in human history. Spanish mining operations were still extracting more precious metals than most countries had ever possessed. Spanish treasure fleets were still transporting cargo values that exceeded entire European nations' annual economies. But Spanish wealth was no longer sufficient to maintain Spanish Empire because Spanish Empire had become too expensive for any level of wealth to sustain. Spanish success had created commitments that exceeded Spanish capabilities, even when Spanish capabilities remained unprecedented by historical standards. Spanish imperial collapse wasn't caused by external conquest or internal revolution. It was caused by mathematical impossibility. Spanish authorities had created an empire that cost more to maintain than the largest treasure supply in human history could fund. Spanish wealth had become Spanish liability through systematic overextension. The Spanish Empire of 1650 was still the largest political entity in human history, still controlled territories on 4 continents, and still possessed more liquid wealth than any country that had ever existed. But Spanish Empire was also economically unsustainable, militarily overextended, and systematically converting Spanish assets into Spanish liabilities. Spanish imperial collapse was economic suicide disguised as military defeat. Spanish authorities had used unprecedented wealth to create impossible commitments, then discovered that even unlimited silver couldn't fund unlimited expenses. Spanish success had guaranteed Spanish failure through its own excess. Chapter 10. Modern Echoes. In 2008, when oil prices hit $147 per barrel, Venezuela controlled the world's largest proven oil reserves and was earning over $60 billion annually from petroleum exports. By 2019, Venezuelan citizens were eating garbage to survive. This isn't a coincidence. Venezuela experienced the same economic pattern that destroyed the Spanish Empire. Resource wealth that made domestic production uncompetitive, inflation that reduced purchasing power despite increasing nominal wealth, and government spending that expanded faster than resource revenues could sustain. Venezuelan politicians used oil revenues to fund social programs, military operations, and infrastructure projects that Venezuelan domestic production couldn't support without continuous petroleum exports. When oil prices declined, the Venezuelan economy collapsed because Venezuelan prosperity was entirely artificial, dependent on external resource extraction rather than sustainable economic production. Sound familiar? This is exactly what Spanish America did with silver 4 centuries earlier. The economics term for this phenomenon is Dutch disease, named after Netherlands' experience with North Sea natural gas discoveries in the 1960s. When countries discover valuable natural resources, resource wealth makes other economic activities uncompetitive by increasing domestic prices and reducing incentives for productive investment. Resource abundance accidentally destroys economic diversity. Spain was history's first documented case of Dutch disease, but they definitely weren't the last. Nigeria discovered massive oil deposits in the 1970s, then experienced economic decline as petroleum exports made Nigerian agriculture and manufacturing uncompetitive. Angola, Kazakhstan, and Algeria all experienced similar patterns where resource wealth reduced rather than increased long-term economic prosperity. But Spanish treasure also created the first documented example of what economists now call resource curse, when natural resource abundance leads to economic instability, political corruption, and long-term developmental problems rather than sustainable prosperity. Spanish silver provided immediate wealth that prevented Spanish authorities from developing sustainable economic institutions. Spanish colonial extraction strategies have been repeated by resource companies worldwide, with similarly destructive results. Mining companies in Africa, South America, and Asia often focus on maximum extraction speed rather than sustainable development, creating boom-bust cycles that enrich foreign investors while impoverishing local populations. The Cerro Rico mine in Potosí continues operating today under Bolivian government control, but it remains economically dependent on external markets and foreign technology. Potosí never developed economic diversity beyond mining, so the city remains vulnerable to commodity price fluctuations, just as it was during Spanish colonial period. Modern Bolivia still experiences many of the problems that affected Spanish colonial administration. Economic dependence on mineral exports, limited domestic manufacturing capacity, and vulnerability to external market disruptions. Spanish colonial extraction strategies created economic patterns that persist over 400 years later. Spanish inflation patterns during the price revolution provide historical precedent for understanding modern inflation crises. Quantitative easing policies implemented by central banks during economic crises operate on similar principles to Spanish silver imports, increasing money supply faster than economic production to stimulate economic activity. The 2008 financial crisis response involved central banks creating trillions of dollars in new currency to fund government spending and private sector bailouts. This monetary expansion caused asset price inflation, increased wealth inequality, and created financial bubbles similar to Spanish price revolution effects, just with paper currency instead of silver. Spanish experience demonstrates that even massive wealth increases can cause economic problems if that wealth isn't managed sustainably. Modern economists studying Spanish colonial history recognize that Spanish authorities made policy errors that contemporary resource-rich countries continue repeating. Spanish treasure fleet logistics created the foundation for modern global supply chains, but also demonstrated vulnerabilities that remain relevant for international commerce. Spanish dependence on long-distance transportation for essential goods created systematic vulnerabilities that modern economies still experience. The 2021 Suez Canal blockage that disrupted global shipping for 6 days caused economic impacts similar to Spanish treasure fleet disruptions during the 17th century. Modern supply chains are more efficient than Spanish colonial logistics, but they're also more complex and potentially more vulnerable to systematic disruption. Spanish colonial silver mining established precedents for labor exploitation that continue affecting global mining operations. Modern mining companies in developing countries often implement working conditions and wage structures similar to Spanish colonial practices, prioritizing extraction speed over worker safety or community development. Contemporary discussions about cryptocurrency often reference Spanish colonial silver as an example of how currency values depend on scarcity and trust rather than intrinsic utility. Bitcoin's design specifically attempts to prevent inflation by limiting total currency supply, learning from Spanish experience that unlimited money creation reduces currency value. Spanish treasure fleet piracy established precedents for economic warfare that remain relevant for modern international relations. Contemporary economic sanctions, trade route disruptions, and financial system attacks operate on similar principles to pirate warfare against Spanish shipping, targeting economic infrastructure rather than military capabilities directly. The 2014 Russian sanctions following Ukraine invasion affected Russian economy through financial isolation and trade restrictions rather than direct military action. This economic warfare strategy follows patterns established by Dutch, English, and French attacks on Spanish treasure fleets centuries earlier. Spanish colonial extraction also provides historical context for understanding modern environmental destruction caused by resource extraction. Spanish silver mining in Bolivia and Mexico created environmental damage that remains visible today, contaminated water supplies, soil degradation, and landscape destruction that continues affecting local populations centuries after Spanish colonial period ended. Modern lithium mining in Bolivia, Argentina, and Chile follows similar patterns to Spanish silver extraction, prioritizing rapid resource extraction for export markets while creating environmental costs that affect local communities disproportionately. Spanish colonial precedents demonstrate long-term consequences of extraction-focused development strategies. Spanish economic suicide through wealth abundance provides lessons for modern resource management policy. Countries that discover valuable natural resources can avoid Spanish colonial mistakes by investing resource revenues in education, infrastructure, and economic diversification rather than funding consumption that exceeds sustainable production capacity. Norway's sovereign wealth fund represents successful application of lessons learned from Spanish colonial experience. Norwegian authorities invested North Sea oil revenues in diversified international assets rather than using petroleum wealth to fund unsustainable government spending. Norwegian resource management created long-term economic sustainability rather than Dutch disease effects. But most resource-rich countries haven't learned from Spanish colonial experience. Contemporary examples of resource mismanagement, Venezuela, Nigeria, Kazakhstan, Algeria, demonstrate that Spanish colonial mistakes remain common despite centuries of historical evidence, showing how resource wealth can cause economic destruction. Spanish treasure impact on European inflation provides historical precedent for understanding how global economic integration can transmit economic problems across national borders. Spanish silver didn't just affect Spanish markets. It created inflation across European trade networks that changed economic relationships throughout multiple countries simultaneously. Modern global financial integration creates similar possibilities for economic problems to spread rapidly across international markets. The 2008 US housing crisis caused economic disruption in European, Asian, and South American markets because global financial systems were interconnected enough to transmit American problems internationally. Spanish colonial experience demonstrates that economic success and economic sustainability aren't identical concepts. Spanish Empire achieved unprecedented wealth and global dominance while creating economic structures that guaranteed eventual collapse. Spanish authorities confused temporary prosperity with permanent success, leading to policy decisions that prioritized short-term gains over long-term stability. This distinction between success and sustainability remains relevant for modern economic policy. Countries, corporations, and individuals can achieve impressive short-term results while creating long-term problems that exceed short-term benefits. Spanish colonial history provides cautionary examples of how apparent success can disguise systematic self-destruction. The fundamental lesson from Spanish treasure fleet history is that infinite wealth doesn't guarantee infinite prosperity. Even unprecedented resource abundance requires sustainable management to create lasting economic benefits. Spanish colonial experience proves that getting rich and staying rich are completely different challenges that require completely different strategies. Spanish treasure fleets were logistical miracles that successfully transported more wealth across greater distances than anyone thought possible. They were also economic disasters that transformed Spanish strength into Spanish weakness through systematic mismanagement of unprecedented opportunities. Modern economies continue facing similar challenges: how to manage resource abundance sustainably, how to avoid inflation from monetary expansion, how to maintain economic diversity despite temporary advantages, and how to distinguish between genuine prosperity and artificial wealth that depends on unsustainable extraction. Spanish colonial history isn't just historical curiosity, it's economic education that remains relevant for contemporary policy decisions. Spanish mistakes are modern cautionary tales disguised as ancient history. So we've seen how Spain discovered the largest treasure supply in human history, then used that treasure to systematically destroy their own empire over 150 years of economic suicide disguised as prosperity. The numbers remain staggering even today. Between 1500 and 1650, Spanish America produced 150,000 tons of silver, enough precious metal to mint currency for entire continents. Spanish treasure fleets transported wealth equivalent to 25% of European GDP annually across 5,000 miles of dangerous ocean routes. Spanish authorities controlled more liquid wealth than any country in human history, before or since. But Spanish wealth became Spanish weakness through systematic policy failures that transformed every advantage into a liability. Spanish silver caused European inflation that made Spanish goods uncompetitive. Spanish treasure attracted pirate attacks that cost more to defend against than the treasure was worth in net terms. Spanish global dominance required military expenses that exceeded even unlimited silver production. Most destructively, Spanish wealth prevented Spanish authorities from developing sustainable economic institutions. Spanish America focused on silver extraction rather than economic diversification. Spanish Europe became dependent on imports rather than developing domestic production. Spanish global empire expanded faster than Spanish economic foundations could support. Today, 4 centuries later, we can see Spanish colonial patterns repeated across the modern world, with depressingly similar results. Venezuela used oil wealth to fund unsustainable government spending, then collapsed when petroleum prices declined. Nigeria discovered massive petroleum deposits, then experienced economic decline as oil exports made other economic activities uncompetitive. Angola, Kazakhstan, and Algeria all demonstrate how resource abundance can reduce rather than increase long-term prosperity. Spanish treasure fleet history provides crucial lessons for contemporary resource management, but most resource-rich countries haven't learned from Spanish experience. The same economic patterns that destroyed Spanish Empire continue affecting modern economies because the fundamental challenges of managing resource abundance haven't changed. The real lesson here isn't that wealth is dangerous, it's that unsustainable wealth is more dangerous than poverty. Spain could have used American silver to build lasting economic institutions, develop diverse production capabilities, and create genuine prosperity that didn't depend on continuous resource extraction. Spanish authorities chose instead to treat American treasure as free money that could fund unlimited consumption. Spanish colonial experience demonstrates the crucial distinction between temporary success and permanent sustainability. Spanish Empire achieved unprecedented global dominance while creating economic structures that guaranteed eventual collapse. Spanish wealth lasted long enough to reshape world history, but not long enough to create lasting Spanish prosperity. Whether we like it or not, Spanish colonial patterns remain relevant because resource wealth continues tempting countries to make similar mistakes. Easy money, whether from silver mines or petroleum deposits, creates incentives for immediate consumption rather than long-term investment. Resource abundance makes sustainable development seem unnecessary until resource production declines and sustainable alternatives don't exist. Spanish treasure fleets were simultaneously one of history's greatest logistical achievements and one of history's most effective economic suicide machines. Spanish authorities proved that humans can successfully transport unprecedented wealth across impossible distances, then use that exact success to destroy themselves through systematic mismanagement. The Spanish Empire wasn't conquered by enemies, it was consumed by its own excess. Spanish global operations became too expensive for even unlimited treasure to sustain. Spanish wealth made Spanish survival impossible through policies that prioritized immediate gratification over long-term stability. But Spanish colonial history also demonstrates human capacity for incredible achievements under seemingly impossible circumstances. Spanish conquistadors established control over territories spanning 4 continents. Spanish engineers created mining operations that extracted silver from mountains 12,000 feet above sea level. Spanish navigators developed transportation networks that successfully moved massive wealth across 3 major ocean systems simultaneously. Spanish treasure fleets represent both human capability at its most impressive and human judgment at its most catastrophically flawed. Spanish authorities accomplished logistical miracles while making economic decisions that guaranteed their eventual destruction. Spanish colonial history is simultaneously inspiring evidence of human potential and sobering evidence of human limitations. Spanish silver didn't just reshape Spanish history, it created the first global economy by providing currency that was accepted from Manila to Moscow, from Stockholm to the Sahara Desert. Spanish treasure established trade networks that connected Europe, America, Asia, and Africa in comprehensive commercial relationships that persist today in modified forms. Spanish colonial extraction strategies also established precedents for economic exploitation that continue affecting global development patterns. Modern resource companies often repeat Spanish colonial mistakes by prioritizing extraction speed over sustainable community development, creating boom-bust cycles that enrich external investors while impoverishing local populations. The environmental consequences of Spanish colonial mining remain visible across former Spanish territories 4 centuries later. Contaminated water supplies, degraded landscapes, and disrupted ecosystems in Bolivia, Mexico, and Peru demonstrate long-term costs of extraction-focused development strategies that contemporary mining operations continue implementing. Spanish treasure fleet history ultimately reveals that economic success without economic wisdom creates temporary prosperity that causes permanent destruction. Spanish authorities achieved unprecedented wealth through incredible effort, then squandered that wealth through policy decisions that consistently prioritized short-term advantages over long-term sustainability. So the question remains, what would you do with unlimited wealth? Spanish colonial experience suggests that most people, including sophisticated political leaders with access to expert advice, would probably make similar mistakes. Resource abundance creates temptations that few individuals or societies have successfully resisted. Spanish Empire controlled more wealth than anyone thought possible, dominated more territory than Rome at its peak, and maintained global power longer than most civilizations exist at all. Spanish colonial achievements were genuine historical miracles that demonstrated human potential for incredible accomplishments under extraordinary circumstances. But Spanish Empire also proves that even unlimited wealth can't compensate for fundamentally unsustainable policies. Spanish treasure was powerful enough to reshape world history, but not powerful enough to overcome Spanish economic suicide. Spanish colonial experience represents both human achievement at its most impressive and human failure at its most comprehensive. The Spanish treasure fleets transported more than silver across dangerous oceans. They transported the seeds of their own destruction, disguised as unprecedented prosperity. Spanish colonial history isn't just about one empire's rise and fall. It's about the eternal human challenge of distinguishing between genuine success and temporary advantage that creates permanent disadvantage.